We are live then.
Cool, cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We will just be waiting for some time, be in the zone until everyone joins in.
Yep. Maybe we'll give people like maybe 4 minutes until everybody joins, and then we're gonna kick it off.
Absolutely. Hi, James, how are you today?
Good. I'm based in Colorado and we have a nice sunny day.
Is there snow in Colorado at this time of the year?
Usually up until around May. We're having an unusually early spring right now. So we get these little snowstorms, but they melt away pretty quick. So it's not too bad.
Nice. Do a lot of people come to Colorado for skiing or?
They do, and our ski resorts are doing well. They still have lots of snow. I'm in the southern part of the state, and Colorado Springs are just outside of it. And so we tend to not have snow build up quite like the ski resorts do. So all the snow dumps onto those mountains, and as it moves from west to east, and then once it gets east, it's not usually too bad. So, yeah.
How's the weather on your side, Vedran, in Croatia?
We've had like a lot of rough days, what I would say, but I think next, as of like this week, the rest of the week, it's going to be like 15 degrees, which is really great. And I guess the rest of the US is like on daylight savings time already. We're still not. I think we're gonna switch at the end of this month, so let's see. Let's see how that goes, basically.
I mean, I still haven't understood the difference between. I just moved to Europe, so for me, this whole concept of daylight savings time is completely new.
You'll get used to it. I think they wanted to like not have that be switched, and we all decide on one time zone, but I don't think that worked out, or at least not that I know of. Fun fact, I named my dog Aspen, based on the Aspen, Colorado. So yeah, all because he's like all white, and kind of always reminded me of Aspen.
That's brilliant. I love
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
And then we have Aspen now as an API testing tool, which was then named based on the Aspen, like the pet.
Yeah, we were sitting in a room, and everybody was like, "What are we going to name our API testing app?" And like, there were a lot of names. I said, "Why don't we just name it Aspen?" And there is a backstory and everything, but yeah.
I think we can get started. We are.
I think so. Pratim, Matthew gave me a message that he added what you asked for. Just make sure you refresh the thing and see if that's there.
Okay, let me just quickly.
I think he added it to the last slides. You're gonna have to move it.
Okay, no problem. Let me just get that. Oh, no.
You have to refresh, I believe.
Yeah, just a minute. I'm gonna first refresh it.
Again, welcome everybody. I think we're gonna be kicking it off. Pratim is gonna lead us into the webinar. Just give her a minute to get the presentation up and running, and we're gonna give you some instructions on how to behave, I guess, or what to expect, and we're gonna dive deeper into the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, I think the slide doesn't want to load on specifically your introductions, but I don't think that should stop us because I've done my research well, and I'm quite aware of everyone's names, why we are here, what we are doing. So let me just share my screen. Oops. Yeah, perfect. So hello everyone, and welcome to another webinar with Treblle and API experts. We try to do this every month. We bring in experts from different sections of the API industry, software engineering, and overall anything that is required to scale enterprise software better. And on today's webinar session, we have with us James Higginbotham, and he is an API expert, and he's been working in this industry for quite a lot of time. He has worked with major companies and clients like Cisco, Dell, and currently is also an API strategist and consultant. And then with us, we have the normal duo that you have, Vedran, the CEO of Treblle, and me. I work as developer advocate. So before I give it to Vedran to introduce himself, I would like James to give us a short introduction about him and what he's up to currently.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me here. And hi, everybody. I see quite a few names on the attendees list that I recognize, so you know who you are. My name is James Higginbotham. I'm the founder of Launchini. A lot of what I do is work with enterprise organizations to establish, scale, and mature their API programs. So I do a lot of training, consulting. I have a development background, but I also have a background in product management and enterprise architecture. So I kind of span those three areas, and I combine that into a lot of what I do with API programs for enterprises.
I think we are going to get into this a lot, and we are going to understand different parts. But before that, Vedran, over to you, a short introduction. I'm curious to see how you'll introduce yourself new this time.
It's just one of those things that I say that I'm glad.
Did we?
I think this is a first that we have an old developer background cast right here. So I'm really glad. So my name is Vedran. I'm the founder and CEO of Treblle. But before that, I was also an engineer. So I spent at least like 10 to 15 years on the engineering side, building and shipping APIs. And today we build tools that help people that actually do that very easily. And I'm looking forward to learning more from James about all of the different things that governance and good API design, which I'm a very big proponent of, can actually benefit the entire organization and actually make more money in the long run.
Super excited for this. Before we get into specifically governance and design, I want to give everyone a quick recap of what we'll be learning today and what we can expect, what you can expect from today's webinar. We'll be starting with one of the biggest problems that we see in the API space today. You'll see it soon, but how can API design, governance help to fix these? That's one of the major big topics that we'll be starting with. Then my favorite part, something that I'm looking forward to learn more from James, is around federated API governance. Now, sounds like a very heavy word, but I'm super interested to understand what exactly it means and how it has helped enterprises, how it can help any team that's trying to grow. Then we'll be seeing some real-world API programs and examples from Vedran and James around what they've seen with customers, with clients, what has worked, what has not worked. And finally, we will talk about the biggest elephant in the room, which is AI, and how does AI fit into this whole conversation around governance and design, and where it actually doesn't. I think, James, this is where I think you'll be bringing in a lot of expertise, where devs shouldn't definitely be using AI. So pretty excited for that section. And finally, the questions, we'll be taking questions in the end of the session in the last 15 minutes. So if you have any questions throughout the session, feel free to write them down. We will take them up in the last 15 minutes. But yeah, so the main problem that I spoke about is API sprawl. Now, first, I would like to give a quick understanding of like what API sprawl is. We are talking here about everyone, different teams building APIs back to back, coming based on what customers are wanting, based on what different clients are expecting, internally, externally, things coming in from both sides. And the end result is you build a lot of APIs, sometimes endpoints that you don't need, you need, and it ends up just being like a big mess of the wool that is stuck together and you don't know how to open it. And this is what we're seeing everywhere, right? Vedran, like this is what the API report says.
I absolutely agree. One of the first things that we've observed is how complex and vast the enterprise API landscape is becoming, especially in the both in the number of APIs. So, like I said, any enterprise company we meet generally more than 1,000 APIs. The second problem is I think the growth of the complexity. When we compare the data from 2023, the average number of API endpoints on an API grew from 20 around 22 to actually 42. So that's almost like a double increase in complexity. Again, you can tie that into many different things, but I think AI is definitely contributing here. But I think overall, APIs are growing, the number is growing, and they're getting more complex. And I think a lot of organizations are simply not ready for that. And it does come to API design and governance. And I would love to hear from James what his kind of experience has been so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I can definitely confirm that number from your survey that 70% of enterprises manage 1,000 or more APIs. Many of my clients that I work with, I consult to, they have anywhere between 4,000 and 6,000 APIs easy. And I think some of that is a result of some of the top-down mandates of we must deliver microservices. And so there's perhaps been a little bit more emphasis on breaking things down into smaller components, which then makes it a little bit more difficult when you start searching your catalog and doing discovery, trying to find an API you need to use. Which one do I use? Is it this account's API or that account's API or another account's API? Because they all exist in different lines of business or domain areas. They're not differentiated. Or perhaps people have put boundaries around resources. And instead of business capabilities or capability driven APIs. And so I've seen a huge number of these APIs show up quite a bit. Sometimes they overlap in duplicate scope. Sometimes there's just a lot of complexity in a particular part of the organization, and it just requires a lot of APIs to get it all done. But one of the things that I do see a lot of times is this focus on integration-based design of APIs rather than capability-based. So we don't start thinking about it from the business perspective, but instead thinking about it from systems and data models, and that causes a lot of proliferation as well. And I really encourage organizations to start looking at a more capability-driven model, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later.
One thing that's very interesting to me, I kind of feel like organizations are actually becoming aware of all of this. Would you say that's true?
They're aware of the sprawl. They're trying to figure out how to manage it. And I'm seeing different tactics used to do that. Yeah, so a lot of the organizations that I work with will say, you know, we have a lot of API sprawl. We're using a lot of tools to help try to get control over this. But how do we kind of address the root cause of it? How do we get in deeper into that? And that's where we spend a lot of time working on and rolling things out, rolling different processes out, better API governance, scaled API governance, and so on.
Okay.
So what I'm hearing from you, James, is sometimes there is a system that's not being followed across the enterprise. Everyone's doing their own thing probably, or everyone has their rules and a set of basically design system that everyone's following, and this is probably leading to more API sprawl. Is that a good way to see where this is coming from?
I would say that's part of it. I would also say that there's been a huge emphasis on and continued following of integration-based patterns. So when we think about it, a lot of organizations are building APIs because they need data out of a specific system. So they build an API to wrap that legacy system or that currently running system, and then they start doing that over and over and over again. And so you have all these APIs that represent some slice of a business capability. And then they try to combine all those things together. And then they build an API layer on top. And it just becomes more and more complex. And the sprawl grows quite a bit because we're not sitting down and thinking, well, what is it that our customers, our partners, our business, what are the different ecosystems we're serving, and how what kind of APIs do they need to serve those different ecosystems? Instead, we end up thinking about systems, and we think about integrations, because that's what developers are sort of taught to do from their early days. And I think it requires a more fundamental shift to something that's more business capability driven, that thinks about things from the outside in. And so when we take that approach, we don't start looking for boundaries around systems or proliferation of APIs around specific systems or data models. We look around, how do we deliver outcomes? What's a problem, and how do we solve that with a specific outcome and a series of steps to get there?
Do you think design and governance starts at an engineering level, and getting enough education and making sure that engineers are not just in charge of actually building this out in a programming language, but actually implementing some of these design principles? Or do you think that that should be done in some other area or in some other team?
I wouldn't say it's another team. I would say it's a collaborative effort. So if I think of a Venn diagram, I think of business, product representation, product managers, product owners within the enterprise, and some representation from your IT group, your technical team, all need to work together. And what I continue to see is these siloed operations. And so business says we want to achieve this goal, and the tech team says, great, I'm going to go run with it. And then they start designing stuff and figuring out what data they need, instead of sitting down and having really deep conversations with the business folks to say, well, what's the actual problem? What are the outcome? What are the steps we need to get there? How does this line up with our business architecture, our operating model? How do we align all those things together? The developers just immediately go, I need this piece of data, this piece of data. This is going to be a Lambda. This is going to be this. And we start solutioning before we actually know what we need. And I would kind of attribute that to sort of more of a code first agile mentality that we've had over the last couple of decades, where we've pushed agile so far that we've stopped asking questions and just value code more than valuing requirements and understanding. And so if we step back and we actually sit down and have understanding, the tech teams can, in fact, own those APIs, but they should be representative of business, which means we need to get those conversations going. If the tech team's not able to have those conversations, that might mean bringing someone in from product or letting business drive some of that. And I've actually implemented both models of that in different clients, depending on kind of what their culture is and their organizational structure and so on.
Do you, if I may, Pratim, one important, I like being agile and speed. And I think for a lot of non-enterprise companies, that's probably one of their priorities. But we do hear that, some of these companies want to speed up. Does it necessarily mean that you're giving up on, design quality and governance? If you introduce those, are you slowing down? Or is this just a matter of process and essentially making sure that, you can actually implement some of the things that we're going to talk about here in a very, very efficient way?
Yeah. So it's really fascinating. What I've seen is people will get a little frustrated. They're going to be a little uncomfortable when they have to sit down and actually start asking questions and capturing a few requirements. What they find is they hit an aha moment, usually about halfway through the design process that I teach. And what happens is they go, oh, okay, yeah, so this API isn't about a data model. This API isn't about an IT system that I have running, maybe that I acquired through an acquisition, perhaps. This API is about delivering an outcome to a certain group of people. It's a partner or set of partners. It's our customers. Maybe it's through a UI and it's indirect to an end user, or maybe it's direct. We have developers that are going to be consuming these APIs. And so they get a little frustrated and a little uncomfortable because we're stepping back and we're not talking about JSON first thing. We're not designing our HTTP URLs and methods and everything else. And but what happens is they realize, and I just had someone say this to me about 2 weeks ago, is what you did is you helped us, one, unify on a resource model that represents how our business operates, not how our systems operate. So rather than having a bunch of APIs that take different inputs, they now have been able to unify on a resource that they can then use, like a pipe and filter architecture pattern for those that had that kind of technical familiarity with that. The idea that I can take a resource and send it through a pipeline and it gets processed in different ways, it gets decorated and improved in different ways, and it comes out in this robust fashion, instead of these anemic APIs that require me to think about that integration. So what they end up doing is they spend a little bit more time up front, but the end result is less testing and everything else.
I want to take a step back here, and Vijay, I want to understand from you and overall, how does Treblle look at governance, and what is our definition of governance? Because
Yeah.
it's a big spectrum. And then I would like to know from James also, because we will be getting into federated governance and more deeper aspects of that. But on a bigger scale, what does governance mean for us?
I think that the way that we look at things at Treblle when it comes to governance, we look at three things. We look at generally, they're actually very close to what James does, but we look at design quality itself, security, and performance. I feel like those three are where we can actually measure and automate the most. And we're going to talk about some of these things a bit later. But I know one of the pain points that we heard from a lot of these companies is, okay, we want to introduce governance, but we don't have an easy way to measure output, or we don't actually have an easy way to measure these things. So we sat down, we essentially took a look at what does what does a good API look like, and we essentially define a pretty opinionated set of industry standards and best practices that we think spans across design, performance, and security. And we run every single API against that in real time, giving you that runtime access to all of that data. Because I think one thing that we've learned is, having access to runtime data and trusting somebody that they actually did something is rather different. So for me, runtime is the only source of truth. Nothing else actually when it comes to an API should matter. We do allow you to bring your own spectral rules and basically customize what those tests are. But at its core, we look at three categories, and we like to get runtime data around that.
Interesting. One small anecdote I would like to share is I recently visited JS World, where we spoke about the Treblle report. And while I had a chance to talk with a few API developers, specifically from JavaScript domain, or some people who are working with the whole backend infrastructure, I ended up asking them, so how does the API infrastructure look, and what do you do in cases of API sprawl? And the first thing they mentioned was like, if there's an API mess, we don't take care of it. We have an expert governance team, and they are the ones to take care of it. And that was my first connection of that, like, instantaneous response to what we've been seeing in the report. And I personally feel like, does that waste more time or more resources back and forth? And if this can be tackled earlier, James?
Yeah. So, well, let me share my definition of API governance. Maybe I'll shed some light, and then we can dig into that question too. So the way I define it is, API governance is a framework of policies, processes, and procedures that organizations implement to ensure their APIs are designed, developed, and managed in a consistent, secure, and efficient manner in alignment with business goals. And so I look at it more than just runtime. Actually, I have eight pillars that I draw upon whenever standing up a new API program or API platform. And the three key groups are strategy enablement, operations, and management. There's three different areas. And so those different disciplines all combine together to create an effective API governance program. If we leave any one of these out and we focus purely on runtime, then we're not aligning our APIs necessarily with what our business needs, what our marketplace needs. If we forget strategy, then we end up suffering from the perspective of, what APIs are we focused on first, what are our priorities, and how do things line up? So there are a number of policies that, when you think about API governance, you probably are operating under, your organization's operating under already, and you just maybe haven't written them down. So one of the policies I mentioned before was, if everything's going to be decomposed as a microservice, is there a policy and a procedure for how you identify the boundaries and then roll those out as part of your APIs? And if there isn't, then you can create sprawl. Or if your policy or one of your key metrics is, how many APIs do we have, then we're valuing the quantity over the quality and over the enablement of our partners, our customers, and our internal business operations. So when we think about those things, it's really important to kind of think about it in that perspective. And I know it's easy sometimes to just think about the runtime because it's out there, and we got to make sure they're scaling, got to make sure they're secure, got to make sure that we're not generating a lot of 500 errors or something else. And that's part of it, but that's not all of it.
So a lot more process, a lot more before runtime, I guess, a lot more involvement before you get to runtime.
A lot of why, a lot
Okay.
of whys, because if you just say, here's what we're going to do, we're going to use REST APIs, we're going to use GraphQL APIs. It's like, why? What's the advantage? We're going to use OAuth 2 as a framework. Why? What are we doing that for? Those are some simple ones, but you can get into deeper and deeper ones. So you can start thinking about, okay, what's our executive policy? What about an API first culture? Why do we have an API first culture? Why do we insist on doing design first whenever possible, or at least collaborative design, so that we're thinking about our APIs as digital representations of our business capabilities and what we bring to the marketplace? Why do we do that? That helps a lot, because when teams get into the nuts and bolts of designing an API, implementing an API, deploying it, monitoring it, managing it, all of that, there's micro decisions everybody has to make every day. And you're never going to cover every micro decision in your governance framework.
Yeah.
But if you have a series of policies that help you to make that decision, you now have a decisioning framework that allows teams to be able to make some decisions that align with the way the organization's going. If you don't do that, then it's do's and don'ts. It's, those people that make those rules don't understand, my woes of the day. If we have policies and then some procedures and processes in place, then we can make that decision to say, yeah, I know we do it this way, but for this particular instance, the benefit of the consumer outweighs our standard. Let's all talk about how this deviation might actually be to their benefit and improve developer experience and improve the onboarding experience, and therefore win a customer for life potentially. So there's a lot of different reasons why you would do that.
So this all connects back to the one point that you had. We spoke shortly before going on the webinar, was communication, and this is also something that you have mentioned in your book around API design. So tying it back, when your tooling and your business and your API culture of the company work hand in hand, that's when you could basically have the best way to do it without any bottlenecks or least amount of bottlenecks. Is that a good way to sum up our discussion around starting, like how to set up governance and what governance looks like?
Yeah, I think from the communication perspective, what really benefits is, if you think about, there's kind of 3 layers of communication. There's sort of the network protocol communication, where we spend a lot of time in the API design world, focused on which HTTP method to use and which response code to use and how JSON should be structured, and do we serialize objects or do hypermedia, and all these different decisions. And that's all well and good. But there's also communication with the developers, which is why we focus on great API documentation, which might go back to a policy in your governance to say, our APIs will be documented at least with Open API specification, or Open API specification in a getting started guide, or whatever it is. And it may vary based on the type of API that you're building. So you have machine-to-machine communication, that's the network level. You have the developer-to-developer communication, that's how do you use this API and be effective with it. And then there's the human-to-human communication. That's kind of the marketplace. Who am I serving? What do they need? How am I solving their problems? How am I bringing the job to be done in some automated way, or some digitized manner that helps me get things done day to day? So that communication and all of that builds upon the policies you define for your governance, and will help your teams make decisions day to day on how they handle their API design efforts, how they manage, how they monitor, what tooling they select, and a lot of other things.
I really like the API design analogy and how you drew it to that being equal to communication, because in a sense, if we compare that to us humans, like, yeah, sometimes you can walk in a room and you're going to be saying something, but your body language says something else, right? And everybody picks up on that. And I kind of feel like that's the point of API design. Like, you're kind of essentially communicating something without actually saying anything. So if everything is good, like if you build a good API, to a degree, this might be controversial, but I don't actually need any additional documentation in order to actually be able to understand what I need to do in there. What are the endpoints? What am I supposed to do here? How do I authenticate, and some other things. So I definitely agree, like getting API design to a point where it speaks for itself is something that I think every organization should strive for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what I talk about in my book that you're featuring here right now is the ADDR process: align, define, design, and refine. So a stepwise process that helps you align on the needs and requirements and really understand the problem, defining what the API needs to do before we get into all the network decisions, the protocol decisions, then designing it, REST, GraphQL, gRPC, what have you, and then refining, which means getting feedback and improving it. And one of the core principles of this whole thing, and especially the align phase, is if our API design doesn't reflect the way the end developers and marketplace talks about things, if it's not using terminology, domain terminology, not that you use internally. Everybody has these code names or acronyms for their systems, for their data models, their data stores, their processes, and everything else. That's internal. If you put that in your API, no one's going to know what that means.
Right.
But if you start talking about domain vocabulary, then the domain design, if it reflects that vocabulary, as you said, will then make it easier to what I don't need too much documentation. I might need inspiration. I might need things to show me what else I could do that I hadn't thought about with it. But the understanding of how to use the API should be straightforward. So I see in like insurance and banking and others, they'll have all these internal terminology or internal lines of business or business units or whatever. And they'll have their own terminology within each one, and unifying on that terminology as you design your API makes a huge difference about how you can engage the marketplace.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
James, you've spoken about versioning from day one. I want to understand from you, and then Vedran, because we also have our internal APIs where we make sure that we have the best system ourselves. But then, what do you exactly mean by versioning from day one? Just making sure that versions are updated, or does versioning here stand for a more standard way of showing different updates?
It really goes back to your API lifecycle. If you go in, unless you're a very disciplined team, and there are some teams that are disciplined enough to design an API and evolve it and never have to introduce a breaking change. But when I think about versioning, I think about the lifecycle of the API. And that means thinking about when you're introducing new capabilities to an existing API, what am I doing to that? Do I recognize what could potentially create a breaking change for someone? And if you haven't put versioning in from day one, recognizing that, you know what, APIs are forever and someone might stay on version 1 for a long time, but I need version 2 because of certain reasons, then you're going to run both at the same time. You need to have that built into your lifecycle and your design processes and everything else. If we don't do that, then what I end up seeing is somebody just said, well, this is the only API we need or only version we need of this API. They throw it out there. They don't have any kind of versioning strategy at all. And now how do they migrate their consumers? If you have versioning from day one, you're actually going to establish expectations, a life cycle, and a set of processes for how do you roll out new versions of this API? How do you announce it, communicate it? How do you communicate deprecations? How do you communicate new versions? How do you communicate when you're going to deprecate the old version once the new version comes out? If those things aren't figured out, you're going to be figuring them out on the fly, and it's going to be really, really hard because your consumers are going to get upset with you. So I think it's important to recognize that APIs are forever. Once you lock in a design, you can add to it, but it's very hard to take away or rename things. And so there are certain breaking changes that we just can't involve. So doing a little bit of upfront design is helpful to try to prevent that from coming up, but it's also recognizing that we have to have that life cycle in place.
Got it. I think we have a lot to cover. Let's move ahead and talk about something I was looking forward to is different API governance models, and specifically centralized and federated. But to start with, what exactly does a federated governance model look like, and how is it different from a centralized model? I'd like to know from you, James. So sorry for giving you, Vedran. I'm gonna give James the highlight for this one.
He's the expert. I'm also learning here.
Yeah, there's actually a third one. So let me add the third one, although it's much more difficult to manage. So they're centralized, federated, and distributed. And in a distributed model, what you really have is you have individual teams kind of making up their own things. And so you'll see those in organizations that have a product-centric structural or organizational model. So they've either acquired products and every product has its own CEO and CTO, and so they kind of manage everything themselves. And what I've seen is certain companies that I've worked with that have a distributed model like that. Everybody does their own thing. They have their own authorization models. Some people are using basics. Some people are using OAuth. Some people are coming up with their own keys. They don't do refreshes. They don't do expiration dates and things like that. So that one's a very difficult one to deal with because everybody's kind of doing their own thing all the time. I want to contrast that against federated in just a minute because I want people to understand that federated is not that distributed model. So a lot of times what organizations that are launching their API programs, they start with centralized. They take one person, 3 people, some number of people, they stand up a center of excellence, center for enablement, API office, API guild, some sort of organization that has a name like that. And it's a group of people that are passionate about APIs, and they start pulling these things together. They put together style guides, they get all their governance in place. Maybe they participate in selecting tools. They work with and collaborate with platform engineering teams to stand up those tools, get them to align with the way they want things to work. That doesn't always scale. And eventually what will happen is those 3 people get overwhelmed. So in organizations that are very large, that centralized group has a work queue that's 3 weeks deep. They can't take a vacation. They get behind. They're not meeting their SLAs, and it's just very difficult for that team. And that's where you start to look at federated governance models. That's where you have that centralized group. They're sort of driving the key processes and procedures and keeping things kind of organized compared to that distributed model. But you stand up API coaches. You find people in different parts of the organization that are passionate about APIs. You train them on how your governance model works. You train them on how to facilitate and communicate with teams and to help guide those teams. So what you have then, you have these representatives that exist all around the organization, these coaches. And these coaches are there working with teams directly. So the teams aren't on their own. They're not having to wait 2 or 3 weeks to get a hold of someone from a centralized group. And then they don't have to spend a lot of time teaching the centralized group how their part of the organization works. Because you're finding coaches that are in that same domain area as the teams that need their support. So they all already speak the same language. They know how things work. And so they're just applying what the centralized governance model would have for them, but they have that support on the edge. And so they're getting feedback sooner, quicker, faster, and they don't feel like they're alone or that they've got to wait and everybody gets upset. And now we're starting to do escalations with VPs involved and everything else to try to get some attention from some 3 people in a centralized group. So that's a model I roll out quite often with a lot of the clients that I have because they have pretty large organizations and a large number of developers.
I definitely agree, and we hear a lot of from a lot of companies about essentially things like center of excellences and enablement. And I think with APIs, the only thing that works is if you have those, you call them coaches, but enablers, if you will, whatever the name is, somebody who actually knows enough about APIs and can actually relay that message consistently across the board. I think that one of the things that helps those folks specifically is, when it comes to actually being able to measure. This is where I think we would. I would help them with tooling and some stuff that will help them actually be more efficient and not have to do actually, the repetitive, boring work, but rather focus on teaching and educating these people. So I think we've seen a lot of and heard a lot of success stories around that. But it's a combination of, like you said, coaches and tooling, in my opinion, from everything that we've seen.
Yeah, and I think one thing to keep in mind too is that a centralized API governance group, COE or C4E, those 3 people see a lot more APIs and patterns and anti-patterns than an average team that's tasked with designing and delivering an API. And you want to spread that knowledge out. And so that coaching model helps to do that. The 3 centralized teams are taking feedback back from the coaches. They're hearing what's going on, what's working, what's not. And then they're pouring into the coaches, and the coaches pour into the people in their area. And it just allows you to scale. So what I like to say is it's allowing you to do non-scalable things, the teaching, the coaching, the feedback in scalable ways, because now you have this coach model. So you have this structure where 3 people are pouring into 50 to 100 or 300 people, and then though they're pouring in to thousands of developers potentially.
Quadron, I want to understand from you, like what James was mentioning is we're talking about a big scale here. We're talking where there are teams and different sections involved where it gets difficult for centralized governance to take care of and manage everything. But how does this space look for teams that are in between scaling, where they have the customers, they have the scale in terms of the APIs, they also have the teams, but they've been on the previous small scale version of getting things working. They started out small, they saw like a huge spike, and now they're like this big new company. So how did this change might seem overwhelming to them, right, James? Like I'd like to get your view also, but I'm aware that when we work with a lot of such customers who've seen spikes and who've scaled, how do these concepts of federated governance or distributed governance make sense to them?
Look, we've seen a lot of things. I think, to James's point, we've seen companies that have 10,000 engineers in their, employed in their company, and five-member API excellence team that basically have to, review every single line of updates that comes to the OpenAPI spec, which again, I definitely agree. Could potentially work, but in the long run, I think without actually tooling to assist those five guys, it's impossible. And without education, they're just going to be back at the front. So what we see from smaller companies that are, starting to scale is they tend to always kind of start introducing governance too late, meaning it's all about how can we build without actually implementing absolutely any safeguards in place. And what James here is talking about to some of these companies might be advanced governance, but at its core, like we're even talking about people not implementing authentication on their APIs, and not even having rate limiting and some of these trivial things which in the long run cost them a lot of money. Insecurity costs them a lot of engineering hours in getting that fixed later. To that point, I would say you can start slow and introduce these patterns, but essentially one thing that even we do internally in Treblle, we have like James said, we have sessions where people who have more experience in building a particular area of the product, or even you per team, we listened to your session about AI and how does AI work, and I learned a ton, even though I kind of hear about that every day. But introducing that as soon as possible, and even in smaller steps and increments, so it doesn't have to be, like James says painful or at the beginning. So trying to introduce some of these things early on in an incremental fashion helps a lot, because if you tell an engineer, hey, you have to do this, a lot of them are going to hate you and going to hate their job and everything they basically despise. But if you educate them on why this is going to be better, and you give them tooling to help them understand that, I think that's the right way to go.
Yeah, I also, one of the techniques I use a lot is training. You might not be able to stand up and be able to enforce all the governance policies you want at the beginning, just like you mentioned, Vedran, is the idea of incrementally introducing them. The other is training, and I've been doing training for over a decade. Been flying all over the world doing API design training, getting people up to speed. And one of the things that I've found that works really well is that we've recorded the training that we offer, and we license it to organizations so they can put it in their LMS, and so that it's in their learning management system, and they can gain that self-paced, scalable effort. If we can then start to train up developers in how to think about API design. That was kind of the reason why I launched APIcoach.io, as well as to allow individuals to be able to do the same thing if their corporate organization doesn't have a license for the content, but to be able to go in and learn these things and start to apply them, that can make a huge difference as well. And then that becomes the training that you use to start upskilling your coaches and preparing your coaches to go out and do what they need to do.
Agreed.
While respecting the time, we are coming to the last 15 minutes, which we had promised we would keep for the questions. So before that, I would like us to have a bit of discussion on what we meant by API design at scale. And James, we discussed the major areas around design, but one of the things that I wanted to understand from you is when requirements come from the customer side for things that are not available with the existing API endpoints, how does that discussion work internally, and how do you align that with business goals, and overall just mirroring whatever your APIs are on the outside with your business expectations?
Yeah, there's a technique called business architecture or business architecture modeling. It's something that I use quite a bit when dealing with APIs. So understanding what part of how the organization works and what its internal operating model is, so we can kind of know how all of the things are coming together, and bringing that together with what those requirements are from our customers or partners. But what the anti-pattern I see a lot of times is that we miss opportunities to actually develop APIs that represent how we can engage with the marketplace. And instead, we end up becoming outsourced IT development shops because a partner says, I'll pay you X amount to build me an API so that I can do this. And so you're catering to just that partner. So there's different techniques to deal with that. But one of those is to start thinking about, okay, let's dig in and understand what they really need and align on their goals, what the internal business goals are. And then once we have that aligned, then it allows us to go forward with a design effort that hopefully takes into account all those different aspects, rather than just a fit for purpose API for one partner that, maybe you get to reuse and maybe you don't. So it means having the hard discussions. It means saying, well, why are we doing this? Why do you need this? What are you trying to do? As an example, in the insurance industry, we have a lot of brokers that work with carriers and represent different customers. So if you think, particularly in commercial insurance, you'll have a fleet of vehicles you want covered with insurance. They'll go to a broker that will go shop that around to different carriers. The brokers themselves are then taking all these different quotes from all these different carriers. So they have their own workflow. That is not the workflow of a carrier. So if a carrier designs an API to give a quote, they're looking at it like, okay, there's going to be a quote come in and we're going to resolve this quote in one way or another. We're either going to accept it, we're going to renegotiate it, whatever. But from a broker perspective, they're pulling and aggregating a lot of different things all at once. Their flow is much different. They would love to have APIs from all the carriers to be able to do that. So to be able to come up with an API that understands that aggregate view and workflow of a broker as compared to how you do things internally is really key. And that's where the opportunity lies, to be able to design an API thoughtfully and outside in during that align phase, compared to how we might just think of how we do things internally, our systems and our data models.
Interesting. Rajan, do you have anything to share in terms of how it looks on how any expectations that come from a customer could, like how James mentioned, that instead of looking for every purpose, you could either look at it from a point where you can look at a bigger business opportunity there, which would then fit for more use cases rather than having a one-to-one development process.
I agree. I generally agree with that. I think at its core, most APIs are actually quite similar, and I think you can reuse a lot of the knowledge that you learn on one API and apply it to a lot of the other ones. Yes, there will be scenarios where you can't do that, but I think building that internal knowledge and building that internal sort of say database is crucial for basically enabling much more faster and much more rapid growth and development. Because if everybody's aligned and they know what they're doing and they have tooling that can help them, hey, you're out of line or you're not out of line, it's a smooth process from there, in my opinion.
Well, let's talk about the common challenges that we see when people are building their governance models or overall like just scaling APIs and what happens. And James, as you mentioned, you've experienced working with clients from insurance, finance. What are some of the most common challenges that you've seen specific to industry, specific to team size, and specific to, I guess, then tech stack as well?
Yeah. So from a perspective across all industries, I see silo teams constantly. I actually see business and IT still lacks a lot of trust. And that means that business doesn't necessarily think IT might deliver in time or will get it right. IT's like, oh, business can never tell us what they really want. If only they would just tell us the requirements the way we need them. There's a lot of siloing of efforts that are undergoing right now with APIs. And I think that's a result of just a lot of mistrust that's going to take time to rebuild. And so I encourage organizations to bring those teams together in a cross-functional way and have some sort of fusion team that delivers on something and can show that actually, in fact, that's not the case. But I see that across all industries. Over governance, as far as what do you mean by that? Just like too many rules or too strict? Yeah. So that goes back to education a lot of times. I mean, what I've found that's the best way to do this is to have a default definition of what a certain standard or practice needs to be, and then one or two alternatives for certain cases. And that usually covers most of the situations. So people have choice. They don't have to overanalyze and go crawl the web or hit 15 different LLMs and start asking questions about, what are all the different patterns for pagination. Here's the primary pattern we use. Here's two other ones that we might want to consider. Here's how we're going to organize and manage our portfolio. Here's how we're going to do all these things. And trying to find ways to make things default. I think everybody's exhausted right now. I think if the last few years have taught us anything, we're all very overwhelmed. We're barely keeping our heads above water in some cases, trying to deliver as fast as we can and get things done and do it the right way. And so having default decisions to keep people from getting into analysis paralysis is really key. And then from a legacy system, a lot of times I think it's just curse of knowledge. Curse of knowledge is, I worked in a worldwide hotel chain, helping them with their API program. And the API that they delivered had a char1 field in the database that described like a pricing strategy or pricing model for a particular property, like how much is this room going to be for? And they exposed the char1. They didn't turn that into something that could be understood. So we have all this curse of knowledge. Well, I know what Z means, price levels, price code Z means, or if you look on your boarding passes on your phone, they'll usually have codes on them that indicate what the point multiplier is for their reward system or whatever, their frequent flyer system or whatever. So the curse of knowledge is really hard with legacy systems. So getting out and talking to people and asking questions, and that's why talking to business is key, talking to your partners are key, doing collaborative API design that ADDR encourages, getting feedback, checking things out, making sure it just aligns. Those are some of the big challenges that I see, and that kind of spans really any industry. I gave you some examples in some specific industries along the way, but I think some people in some industries say, well, we're a unicorn, we do things a little different. I've helped a startup airline get off the ground. I've worked in healthcare, commercial insurance, retail banking, commercial finance, bunch of other ones I'm not even thinking about right now, and pretty much all the challenges are the same. So there's a lot you can learn from that, and it's a lot that I've learned from that in working with teams and understanding kind of where those difficulties are and how to overcome them.
I cannot stop this question. I really want to, I know we are at a short time, but this is a question for both of you. Shouldn't siloed teams be a problem that's already solved? Like, haven't we done I know with experience from like Treblle, we have at every time there is like at every part of your API development or like the way you view your requests, your issues, you have an option to communicate, collaborate with your APIs. It is surprising to me that it's still a problem. Vedran, what do you think?
I think this comes down to, years and years and decades of how people have siloed things off. And, it's and also how some of the vendors and tooling approach these things. So you're always gonna, have a security solution specifically for the security team. You're gonna have an observability solution for the DevOps team. You're gonna have, I don't know, something else for some of these other folks. So people tend to, have been siloing things off for decades. I think where it's really, really hard and where it becomes obvious that siloing doesn't necessarily work is APIs, because it's such a cross-functional, in my opinion, it's such a cross-functional effort that you really need, the product team, the business team, the engineering team, as well as the architecture teams involved in actually producing a world-class API or a world-class API program. So I think this is something that we're tackling, and everything that we're doing at Treblle is there to support that thesis of enabling cross-functional teams, enabling them to have access to data, democratizing that data. Because if I have to go ask my engineer 5 times a day, hey, what's going on here, or do you have this? How many requests are we making, or how many endpoints do we have, and how does that look? That's basically a bad scenario for me, where I don't have access to that data. So it's first enabling people to actually have access to the data, and that's when all these other roles will start asking questions, in my opinion. That's where you're going to get the architecture guy asking their engineer, hey, why don't we have rate limiting on our API? Or the product guy, why did you name this set of endpoints like this, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quick because I know we're short on time. But here's what I would say, and I just recently wrote this up for what might be a new book that I'm releasing. Digital transformation failed over the last decade, and the reason being is because we made it focus on modernization and not cultural transformation. So we didn't take what was necessary, just like you said, Vedran. APIs intersect business, product, and tech. They span everything. Try to deliver a developer portal, and you will find every problematic area of your organization, because the effort required to get approval to put documentation out about an API and then put it on the gateway and make it available and then onboard and guide people through it. It's a stress tester for every part of the organization. It's cross-cutting. And digital transformation focused too much on modernization, and let's put in Kubernetes, and let's put a layer on top of that, and a layer on top of that, and a layer on top of that. And we forgot to bring everybody else along with us. So part of what we have to do moving forward, and part of the COE team's responsibility is building out these governance models, is that they have to bring everybody with them. They have to explain to business, why do we have these policies? We have to explain to business, why is the developer building that API worried about what my partners think or what my customer thinks? It's because all these things overlap. And business, a lot of people don't really understand that. And so we haven't had that cultural transformation that was absolutely essential for digital transformation. We just failed to do that. We focused too much on modernization, and that
Yep.
hurt us. So we still have the silos.
Well said, James. We are going to talk about the biggest elephant in the room that I had mentioned initially. Not in the room, actually. Biggest elephant currently out there when it comes to any digital transformation, AI, anything, everything is how AI touches this aspect of the industry, specifically around governance, and what are the benefits, what are things that you're seeing, what are different strategies, new innovations you've seen around different customers and clients, James, and what do you think are limitations? Because I am quite aware that you have a lot of opinion and experience around where AI shouldn't be used.
Yeah. So what I'm seeing today, I'm seeing people still experiment. A lot of enterprises have internal LLMs. They have their own internal models. They're using either cloud-based resources to make that happen, or they've stood up some of their own infrastructure and they're making that happen. They may have one model, they may have multiple models. They're experimenting with code generation. They're trying things like Copilot and others, and they're trying to get that into people's workflow. I personally don't think we have too much of a problem writing code. In fact, I think we have the opposite. We're writing code too quick, and we're not thinking about what we're actually writing. And so we're not meeting the needs of the business and the needs of our customers. We're meeting our own needs. And that's what goes back to the integration-centric API design. We're focused more on building systems that have to be integrated than we are APIs that actually solve problems. So I'm not too concerned about trying to go faster with code. I think we need to focus more on delivering the right thing at the right time, and then leveraging these tools to deliver it in the right way. So what am I seeing as far as AI within the governance realm or within the API realm? I've done some experimentation. I've worked with some of my clients on this. We've used some of their internal models, some public models. You cannot take the human aspect of the align phase out. You need to be able to ask questions, get clarifications and assumptions, because that goes into your prompts for your AI generation. Right. So in the design phase, you need to be able to get better at doing requirements, which is why I say those skills are kind of atrophied because everybody just started writing code. Well, now if you're not writing code, you got to be able to explain what that code's supposed to do instead of taking it out of your head and immediately turning it into code. You've got to explain it. So now you have to start writing prompts. To write prompts, you have to have requirements. You have to align and understand on what you need to do. And then you can use the LLMs to kind of help you do some of the network communication. So that human-to-human communication, we still need that. Can't get rid of that. The developer-to-developer communication, we can try to help generate some better documentation, but tech writers are still very valuable and have an absolute valuable skill to copy, edit, and to write text and content that guides people in a low cognitive load kind of way. But the machine to machine is where we can automate. We can write the code, we can generate open API specs, things like that. So I'm seeing a mixture. So it's about coming back and saying, okay, if I have a life cycle, what parts of the life cycle can AI handle, what can't it? And usually where there's a human interpretation or human description, you're not going to be able to do it.
I agree. I'm going to put my product hat on. We have 2 AI products specifically for folks in the API lifecycle, and the beauty and the reason why they work so good and the reason why they're popular is exactly what James said. They're not trying to replace a human, but they're solving the boring part that a machine can do. So our first product is Alfred, our AI based API integration assistant, which essentially allows you to generate or your team or anybody on your developer portal to generate integration code based on the Open API spec. So you essentially upload the Open API spec to Treblle, or Treblle generates one, and you can actually embed Alfred directly on your developer portal. And engineers can ask questions like, how do I make an API request to this endpoint in Node.js? And we'll figure that out. Another use case is within our API governance product, we actually check for AI readiness, where again, we try to quantify what does it mean to actually enable machine-to-machine communication between APIs, and how do machines and LLMs interpret your API. So we built in a couple of different rules that we saw play a huge important role, and we can automate all of these different checks. So those are the 2 things. I definitely, I'm going to make an internal joke with Prateem. I definitely don't think that we're in the vibe governance area like we are in the vibe coding area, but maybe one day.
I do agree. Like, although I am an internal AI advocate at Treblle, one thing I have definitely seen is my usage of Trebble's governance and API score has increased with the more you build with AI. And the best way to make sure, like, although if you're vibe coding or like you're using AI, you're still sticking to the standards that will make sure your APIs are built more safely and securely. So I completely agree. We'll definitely come back to see if there's an era of vibe governance. But just to wrap up, what I have learned from you, James, and what Vedran has added to this is around different. There are not 2 types, but there are actually 3 different ways we can look at governance: distributed, centralized, and federated. Then there's also a lot of design is something that goes beyond fixed rules. That it involves a lot of communication. And finally, there's a lot to learn from what peers are doing in basically the financial industry, the medical industry, overall healthcare industry, and making sure AI is helpful, but not giving up on the human part of interacting with experts. Is that a good thing I've wrapped up? Anything else if I'm missing out? Final thoughts?
I think that's a great summary of what we've talked about. I think that does a great job of covering what we talked about.
Words: start early. That's my whatever we said, start earlier.
So true. It is hard. Once everything's in motion and you have teams going, it is very hard to change. You end up having to just grandfather in, kind of legacy, the old APIs and the old rules until they can come up to speed. And I saw people spend 2 years trying to unify their authorization model in a distributed governance model because they didn't have that unified. So It's painful. Yeah.
Cool. Let's dive into questions. We have a lot of them. that I'm seeing. A few have already been answered by James. Thank you for that, James. But I'd definitely like to read them out loud so that everyone who doesn't have an access to reading to the charts. Andy has asked, to what extent should we be pushing for industry-wide standards? James, would you like to quickly give a recap of what you
Sure.
said?
Yeah, so standards can be a good thing. HTTP is an industry-wide standard. It's evolvable, it's extensible. It's served us well, and we leverage that every day, a lot of us. But I think as far as industry-specific standards, say like insurance or healthcare or something else, we have Accord and insurance and fire and healthcare and others. Treat those like separate ecosystems in your company. Design your APIs to provide what your business is unique, what its capabilities are that are unique to the industry, and then support and look at those standards as another ecosystem need to maintain, rather than trying to just adopt purely the standards. Most of the standards are for interoperability, data portability. They're not about your operating model day to day. And as soon as you start figuring that out, you start to realize that the industry standards are just another ecosystem that you need to support. It's another way to leverage your APIs, but it should not control how you design and deliver your APIs and operate as a business.
Got it. Vedran, I think you'd like to take the next one because from personal experiences of what we've seen at Treblle, for these metrics, how do you define an API that is an API? What is defined with an open API document, related set of operations? Some people call each operation/endpoint an API.
For some reason, we get this question a lot, and I hear this question a lot. To me, there's, or at least from my side, and I am pretty opinionated on this, there is no doubt that in my mind, an API is a collection of endpoints or operations or resources, however you want to do it. So every API has multiple different endpoints. I've heard this analogy where people think one endpoint is one API. I mean, you can go about that, but you're probably going to have like tens of thousands of APIs, which again, perspective, I don't think is easy to maintain and manage. I definitely think that you should be building APIs that are purpose built, meaning, hey, this microservice should be doing that, and that's a certain set of endpoints. But you at its core, APIs are collections of endpoints, and if you specifically want to call them operations, you can. I would rather use the word resource. So a collection of resources that are made out of endpoints. So there you go. I've embedded all the words possible.
Yeah, whenever something comes up like this, I always say add an extra word to clarify. So like what you did, is it a microservice API, a platform API, or is it an API product? What is it? And each one of them will have different traits, and it will determine what level of governance you need to have for them. So it's just like when we model, like in the banking industry, you have savings accounts, checking accounts. You might have an auto loan account and other things. Every one of those, if you just called it an account and you had an accounts resource, it'd be doing everything and anything. You'd have one API that does everything and wouldn't be able to do anything very effectively. So adding one or two words to clarify and add context and create a boundary around it is key. So I recognize API products. I recognize platform APIs, which represent business capabilities that might be combined with other things and turned into products, and then microservice APIs, which are back end. And where people get into trouble is thinking a microservice that should be kind of more fit for purpose behind the scenes to decompose complexity. They turn it into a platform API or a product, and they try to make a product out of it when it was really designed for a specific system. That's where most people get in trouble.
I see Anushri in the question. Hi, Anushri. Glad to see you here. For a company just starting to think about API governance, what's the first step they should take? Vedran
Oh,
or James, any takers?
yeah. Go ahead, Vedran. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Wow, I get the hard ones. I think if you're a really small team that doesn't have a lot of APIs, I would start with getting some tooling like our API Insights or something like that that will get you up and running pretty fast and won't necessarily impose on your engineering processes and whatnot, but would definitely serve more as like an educational thing. So don't come in and say, hey, we're going to do API governance from tomorrow. Everybody who commits code is, if they commit bad code, you're done. Start by introducing governance, introducing these processes, introducing tooling that enables you to basically understand what is going on. Because I think at a fundamental, the fundamental problem with APIs is not a lot of people actually see what's going on them. And like I said, giving access and democratizing that data early on is something across multiple different teams is something that you can do. Again, I'm going to plug Treblle here. All you need to do is basically install Treblle, and you can basically get up and running with a minimum set of governance things. You can customize them later on. You'll get the understanding you need, but essentially, if you're starting out, you're going to be more than fine. Just don't go in crazy with an axe or something like that and start rejecting all those PRs because somebody made a mistake. It's going to take time, and that's about it.
I tend to encourage organizations to start with the whys. So why are you doing it? Why do you have an API program? Who's using the API program? So map out the strategy, the purpose. What does it mean to have a successful API program? Find out if your leadership is bought into it. If your leadership hasn't been bought into it fully, then you've got some work to do to make sure you have the right funding and support. So that when it comes down to, do we put this into our API governance, or do we go take the API governance team and retask them on to delivering an API or delivering some feature in a UI or something? That trade-off is very clear. And then start, if you're a small group, I would start finding an API style guide that represents kind of what you need to do, and then start putting the tooling around that. As Vedran mentioned, starting to put those pieces in place. But make sure you understand the why and start to think about how you're going to manage toward it. Leadership today, they're looking for data points, they're looking for results. And if you don't know what they're looking for, then it's going to be really hard for you to deliver what they would see as success. It just means more bureaucracy process, and they don't understand why. So get everybody aligned on it, and start there, and then start bringing in little pieces at a time. Style guide, tooling, putting things into the CI/CD, but not having a block the processes to get your teams up to speed.
Let's try to go through the last 3 questions rapidly. For team, you want to pick one?
I like David's. What do you think, James? Like David has asked about how do these goals around consistency and API evolution look when it comes to like runtime or real-time metrics?
Yeah. Well, one of them is going to be scorecards for your APIs. Shout out to Jason Harmon, who used to be involved with the PayPal API program and is involved with another group now. I can't remember off the top of my head. Sorry, Jason. But yeah, I would say scorecards that allow your API to be evaluated and leave room for improvement. So not everybody is going to score 100% across their entire scorecard, but teams should know where they stand. They should know what the minimum bar is for an API to go out the door to ensure that consistency in those other goals. And if they ask, why are we doing this? You point them back to the policy and say, here's why. So it's all back to the why.
Definitely. We actually have those scorecards up and running. You can literally drag and drop your Open API spec into API Insights or Treblle, and we'll give you the scorecards in real time. So you're at least going to have a starting point.
Finally, we have one question from Zoltan Simon. Can you tell more how to scale the coaching practice? Like coaching practice, 3 experts or just 3? How to coach 1,000 developer? I think, James, you've already answered this. Yeah.
A little bit. Let me just briefly expand on that. Here's what we want to make sure you do. Don't try to coach everyone at once. You're not going to make it happen. If you have 3 experts, those 3 experts should pour into 3 more. And just grow it and invest in specific people. So it might be that they self-select themselves. Some people you've worked with before that really have a good grasp on things. Get their manager's buy-in to make sure that the manager agrees that if they're doing this as an add-on to their daily job role, that everything is okay and copacetic, and they're not going to get in trouble for not delivering something else, or making sure at least that they understand what their priorities are. So that's one thing. And then, just biased, I help organizations do that all the time and take that load off the COE so they can get their work done day to day. But that's how we do it. I go in and understand what the program needs, what its policies, what its strategy, everything is, and then I customize a coaching program, and then I lead coaching sessions and train those coaches up, get to the point where I can certify them and say, yep, you have demonstrated your ability to be a coach and to tackle some of the common decisions we encounter every day. And then ultimately those coaches, as they continue to coach other teams, hopefully they're gaining more experience and they can teach someone else later on once they get a little bit of experience.
Well, thank you, James. That was super helpful. Personally, for me, I learned a lot, and I'm definitely sure everyone who attended today's session has a good understanding of how to get started, how to move ahead if at whatever position they are with respect to their API programs. Thank you, Vedran, for tagging along and making this conversation more interesting and fun. It's always
Hopefully useful as well.
absolutely. But I will say that it was James who took most of the highlight today, and it was interesting to have you, James. Would love to have you again. Probably we do a part 2 because I know these concepts need to be dealt with more depth. But for now, we are beyond the time, and I hope everyone's had a good time. But thank you so much. Have a great evening, morning, wherever everyone's located.
Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
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 Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.